I've been asked, Miss Leah has stayed on me about adding this sermon back into a repertoire. About 10 years ago, I would give this sermon around from congregation to congregation, and it's been sitting on the shelf for a while. And I did a little bit of tweaking to it, but not a whole lot. But I want to talk to you this morning about Esther. And I want to talk to you specifically, the way I've titled the message this morning is For Such a Time as This. It comes out of the 4th chapter of the book of Esther, verse number 14, that says, For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And we'll talk a little bit more as we get into the message about what that phrase, the implications of that phrase in this story. But Esther is a fascinating story, and I want to very quickly kind of give you an outline of what we're going to do in the message this morning. First of all, we're going to look at the characters of the story. Now, I use the term characters. This is not like reading The Death of a Salesman and the story of Biff. These aren't just characters in a story, they're real life people, and they really did live at some point in time. So, but I call them characters because I want to kind of familiarize you with the individuals that we're talking about that are kind of main players in this story. Secondly, we're going to look at the story itself. There are 10 chapters in the book of Esther. We're going to cover those 10 chapters. If you want to turn there, we're not going to go into every detail of those 10 chapters, but very quickly, we're going to go through those 10 chapters, and then we're going to close the message this morning with some lessons I think we can learn from the story of Esther. And that's not going to be an exhaustive list, but there are some things I think we can walk away from this morning. So let's look at the characters first of all. Some of the individuals we're going to be looking at in this story. Number one, King Ahasuerus. He was the king during the time frame, and he was king of Medo-Persia. Now at this time, in the days of Ahasuerus, this was Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even into Ethiopia, over 127 or 127 provinces. So he had 127 provinces that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. So King Ahasuerus brings all these princes together and begins to discuss with them. King Ahasuerus, if we continue reading in verse number 4, when he showed the riches of the glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days, when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So it's quite a party that King Ahasuerus threw. Now, King Ahasuerus, some scholars would say, was the same individual that's mentioned in Ezra 6, verse number 14, that's known as Artaxerxes, king of Persia. So we're during the days of the Medo-Persian Empire is when Esther, the story of Esther is taking place. So after Nebuchadnezzar and the king of Babylon, you get to Daniel chapter 5, you get into the Medo-Persian Empire. Darius, the king of Persia, takes over the kingdom. Cyrus the Great of Persia, Darius the Mede, and then here we've got Artaxerxes, and there's some things in history that says the three of them at one point in time were king of the Medo-Persia Empire together, about 486 BC till about 465 BC, to give you a little time frame. That's King Ahasuerus. Vashti was the first queen we read about in the story, and we're going to look a little bit about Vashti. She is married to Ahasuerus. She is the queen to the king. In Esther chapter 1, after the king had thrown this big party, he wanted to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal to show the people and princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. So apparently Vashti was a beautiful woman. And as king, he called for his wife, he called for the queen, and wanted to show her off to these 127 princes and to all these people that were at the party. Verse number 12, but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned within him. Now I know Dennis Sizemore wants me to preach on that verse right there, right? The king commanded his bride to come, but I'm not going to go there this morning. But the queen Vashti refused to come when the king called for her. The king called and said, I want to show you off. And she said no. that created a little bit of an issue. Esther chapter 1, verse number 18, likewise shall all the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of this queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. For it pleased the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal state unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both great and small. So King Ahasuerus had a problem on his hands. He had a wife that refused to come when he bid her to come. And then all the princes begin to worry. All the women in the kingdom are going to come. If the queen won't come when the king calls, we've got a problem. You're going to have to do something about that. And then chapter 2, verse number 1. After those things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. I don't know definitively what the wrath of King Ahasuerus' wrath being appeased really means. I don't know for sure what that means. He could have set her off in another kingdom somewhere, but he may not have. I don't know. But I'm telling you, Vashti was not in a good place with King Ahasuerus at that point in time, and she was no more queen. So I want to introduce you to the third character of this study. That's Mordecai. And I know there's some discussion about how to pronounce Mordecai. If you look at my Bible, which I use as a reference, it's got phonetical markings in it, and it says Mordecai. But I preached this years ago in Plainview, Texas, and one of the young children came up to me and they said, "You're mispronouncing Mordecai. His name is Mordecai." And I said, "How do you know that?" He said, "I've seen the movie." So apparently, there are other ways to pronounce his name, but I'm going to stay with the phonetical markings that I have in my Bible, and I'm going to call him Mordecai. I'm not always consistent with that, but I try to be to the best of my ability. You other teachers that I stay on all the time about pronouncing names properly. But Mordecai was essentially Esther's cousin in this story. Esther, in chapter 2, verse number 7, he brought Hadassah, which was Esther. That is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So they're essentially cousins. Mordecai and Esther are cousins. For she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So we see a little bit about the character of Mordecai. What an amazing man. He had a heart. He cared about this young lady, this cousin, and her parents were dead. He took her in, cared for her. What an amazing individual. We see a little bit about him. Now, I want to introduce you to Esther. She's kind of what I would call, maybe not kind of, she is what I would call the main character in this story. She's also known as Hadassah, her Jewish name. Esther chapter 2, verse number 7, what we know about her, I've already mentioned, for she had neither father nor mother. But we also find out she was fair and beautiful. She was an amazingly beautiful young lady. Esther was known for her beauty. There's an individual in this story that is the bad guy in the story. His name is Haman, and he was known as the Jews' enemy. Chapter 3, verse number 10, Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad, dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it to the king's treasuries." And the king took his ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. He was an enemy to the Jewish people. Now, this is a side note. It's not going to cost you any extra this morning. But when you look at an Agagite that was a Jew's enemy, we're talking about this goes all the way back to Jacob and Esau. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob and Esau. Jacobites became the Israelites. Esau became the Esauites or the Edomites. Guess what? They were the Agagites. King Agag, if you remember in the story of where they were told to destroy all of these individuals, they kept back Agag the king, etc. They were enemies to each other. from the Jewish people to the Esauites or the Edomites. They were enemies, and this was still going on in the Medo-Persian Empire, okay? So all this anger and hatred and all this stuff had come down through the annals of the history of time, and here we've got Haman, and he, H-A-T-E-D, he did not like severely the Jews, and he wanted them destroyed. So we've kind of looked at the main characters. There are some other characters that we'll see as we go along, but we've looked at the main individuals, the main players in this story. Let's look at the story very quickly. I've broken that down into these sections. There was a beauty pageant that started. Haman had a plot. Esther had a decision to make. She threw a first banquet. Haman was humiliated. She threw a second banquet. Not sure I understand all the reasons why there were two banquets, but I'm a member of the Church of Christ. I'm all for a dinner on the ground. So it all worked. Then Mordecai's decree, and we'll get to the end of the story. The Jews are victorious. So let's start with the beauty pageant. Now King Ahasuerus is by himself because Vashti is no longer the queen. And so here we've got in Esther chapter 2 and verse number 2, then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So he ultimately called, these servants came to him and said, let's look out all throughout the kingdom. Let's find all the fair young virgins. Let's bring them in here. And they brought them all into one house. And they went through this period of time of purification and some of their rituals that they did. And ultimately they said, whoever it is that pleases you, let her be queen instead of Vashti, since Vashti is no longer. Now, Esther was one of these young ladies, and she was brought into this house. And her cousin, Mordecai, walked outside the gate. Look at Esther chapter 2, verse number 11. Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what would become of her. Again, we see a lot of the heart of Mordecai. He absolutely loved this young lady, and she was in a place where he wasn't able to see her, and he's grieving to some degree or another. How is she doing? What's taking place with her? And hoping that she's all right. Now, while he's out there, he runs into overhearing a conversation that's taking place. Esther chapter 2 and verse number 15. When the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, had taken her for his daughter, was come to go into the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. She's a very beautiful young lady, apparently sweet in personality. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So I got ahead of myself just a little bit. She's made queen. Esther is fair to look upon, and I love some of this. Early in verse number 15, she was come to go into the king. She required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. So she didn't need lots of makeup and hair and all that sort of stuff. She didn't need to. She was a beautiful young lady. She didn't need a lot of decoration in the process. Okay, Esther chapter 2. Here's her story. Esther chapter 2, verse number 21. Mordecai is outside the gate wondering what's happening to her. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, I love those names. You know they're bad guys. If your name is Bigthan and Teresh, you are a bad guy. And these were doorkeepers. These were essentially bouncers. And it says they were wroth and wanted to and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. When inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So Bigthan and Teresh were outside the gate, And they were plotting to overthrow the government. They were plotting to overthrow the king, and they were wanting to assassinate the king. Mordecai heard that. He got word to the queen, which is Esther, his cousin, who got word to the king. Ultimately, they investigated this situation. These were bad guys. Bigthan and Teresh are no longer. They were hung on a tree. And then I just want you to notice, because it's going to come back up in the story a little later, these things were written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. They wrote down that Mordecai had saved the kingdom. Again, we see a little bit more about Mordecai's character in that as well. So, Haman, the Jews' enemy, had a plot. Chapter 3, verse number 1. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's house bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. And the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, why transgressest thou the king's commandment? So King Ahasuerus makes Haman his number one guy. Haman's pretty proud of himself. He's the number one guy. And he walks around and everybody's bowing down to him and honoring him and giving him reverence because he's the number one guy. But Mordecai did not do that. Mordecai knew this was an enemy of the Jewish people, and that really bugged the bejeebers out of Mordecai, or out of Haman, sorry. Esther chapter 3, verse number 4, and that came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then Haman was full of wrath. He was angry. Wrath is just, he was mad. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Haman wanted the Jews dead. He could not believe, and Mordecai was just a small example of why he wanted them dead. Mordecai would not bow down and reverence him. Haman was somebody special. He believed he was somebody special, and he should have been reverenced. And so he wanted the Jews destroyed. So he goes to the king, and he goes to King Ahasuerus, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the province of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of this business to bring it to the king's treasury. And the king took his ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. So Haman comes up with this plot and says, there are people, King Ahasuerus, that are trying to destroy you. Let me put a bounty on their head, and let me take care of this for you. And King said, well, if they're trying to destroy me, I mean, you're my number one guy. Do whatever you need to do. And they made it law that they were going to say, he didn't realize he was destroying the Jewish people. He didn't understand that his commandment that put forth was trying to destroy the Jews. But Haman wanted to see them destroyed. He needed the king's authority to do that. So Esther had a decision to make. Mordecai essentially comes to her in beginning verse number 1 of chapter 4. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. Oh, he's in anguish. He's in pain. Mordecai sees what's happening. There's a decree to destroy the Jewish people. Mordecai, those were his people. He loved them. They were Esther's people. She loved them. Mordecai, when you see the phrases, they sat in sackcloth and ashes, or they rent their clothes, all throughout Scripture you see examples of that taking place, and it just shows extreme grief. Okay, they are sitting in sackcloth and ashes, they're renting their clothes, they are in grief over what is taking place, and Mordecai in this case is destroyed emotionally over what is going to take place. So he comes even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth and ashes, and in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So he basically was letting everybody know this is what's taking place. The Jewish people were in grief. They were sitting in sackcloth and ashes. We're going to be destroyed as a people. The king has put out a decree to destroy us. So verse number 8 of Esther chapter 4. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again, Esther spake unto Hatak, and gave him commandment to go to Mordecai. All the king's servants of the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king, into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. So she's queen. Mordecai gets word through somebody else, gets word to her that, hey, he's put out a decree that's going to destroy our people. And he gets word to her. There's a message that comes back to Mordecai and says, you know that if I go into the king and he doesn't extend the golden scepter, I'm dead. I am toast. My life is over. This is not an easy thing to do. You're asking me to go try to save our people, but you're asking me to risk my life to do that. Look at verse number 14. The answer came to him, came to her, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That's where we got the title of the sermon. There are two, what I consider to be pivotal, amazing phrases in the story of Esther, and this is one of them. How do you know that you weren't queen for exactly this moment? How do you know that this isn't the reason you were made queen? This is your queen. You have an opportunity to be able to do something. This is within your power to be able to do it. And she's going, but I could die in this process. And he says, this may be the very reason you exist. This may be the very reason you are queen. And Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. And so Esther sent a message to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast ye for me, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night and day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go into the king, which is not according to the law. And here's my second phrase that I think is amazing in this story, that I would have chosen one of these two to be the title of the sermon. If I perish, I perish. I mean, Esther stood up and she said, you have everybody pray, you have everybody fast, you have everybody... And I'm going to go do what's right. If I perish, I perish. If that's what this means, then I will do what's necessary to make this thing happen. So Esther throws a banquet. And she invites the king and she invites Haman to come to this particular banquet. Esther 5, 1 through 2. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Now here's this moment when Esther goes, if I approach him and he doesn't extend the golden scepter, I'm in trouble. But she does what is needed to do. Even though it wasn't easy to do, she went in and she found favor in King Ahasuerus' eyes, and he extended the golden scepter, and she was able to touch the top of the scepter. So let's keep going. Verse number 3, verse number 4. Then said the king unto her, what will thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given unto thee to half the kingdom. She must have been beautiful. Half the kingdom. You just ask, and I'll give you up to half the kingdom. Okay? And Esther answered and said, if it seemed, apparently they were a community property state. And Esther answered and said, if it seemed good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day into the banquet that I have prepared for them. So he invites them to a banquet, and Haman feels extra special about that. Esther 5, verse number 7, then answered Esther and said, my petition, my request is, if I'd favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them. And I will do tomorrow as the king has said. And then went Haman forth that day, joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. So Haman leaves this invitation and goes, I've been invited to a dinner with the king and the queen and just me. I'm the only other person that's going to be at this banquet. This is amazing. But then he goes outside, Mordecai doesn't bow to him. Oh, and he's enraged. He's somebody special. He's special enough to even get to the banquet with the king. And Mordecai won't even recognize that he's somebody. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself. When he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. You'll love Zeresh. She's an amazing wife. Guys, be careful who you marry, because you don't want to marry someone like Zeresh, okay? Here's Zeresh. Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children and all the things wherein the king had promoted him and how he advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yea, as to the queen, did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily unto the king into the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. You want to talk evil. He goes home to his wife. It's like Ty going home to Lisa going, babe, you're going to be amazed at the great news today. We've been invited to a party. I mean, this is like the best party ever. I mean, we're with the king and the queen. This is amazing. But this one thing is just bugging me. This guy will not bow down and reverence me. And Lisa goes, kill him. I mean, it's just, and not only that, what's even more is Haman's going, that's a good idea. Let's do that. The thing pleased Haman, and so he caused a gallows to be made. They were going to cut off the head of Mordecai because he wouldn't bow down and give him reverence and honor. Haman was ultimately humiliated. Esther chapter 6, 1 through 3, on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Y'all remember where I said these things were written down in the Chronicles of the kings of the Medes and the Persians? Here it is. He's up one night. King Ahasuerus can't sleep. So he says, hey, bring me the books of the Chronicles and read those things to me. So they're reading them to him, and it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done for Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants and ministered to him, there is nothing done for him. So he's up late at night, he can't sleep. They're reading the books of the Chronicles of the Kings. Apparently that's great reading late at night when you can't sleep. And they read about when Mordecai had saved the kingdom from Bigthan and Teresh. And he said, what do we do for him? Did we get him a gift card? I mean, did we do something? Did we write a card? Did we say thank you? What did we do? And the king's servant said, we didn't do anything for Mordecai. We didn't help him at all in this deal. So verse number 6, Haman comes in, talks to the king. The king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to honor more than myself? I love that line. I mean, Haman goes, I've been invited to the party with the king and the queen. Who would want to be honored? I mean, who would the king want to honor more than me? So he got to think about this. Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. Let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with all whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Let me tell you, Haman had this great deal. You want to honor somebody, and I mean, who else but me? Honor me. He said, you ought to put a robe on him and put him on the horse, the king's horse. You ought to run him through the streets of the city and say, we are honoring the man whom the king wants to honor. He was so full of himself. Verse number 10, the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew. Oh, don't you know Haman just absolutely wilted. I mean, Haman's going, I have been invited to the banquet. It's just with the king and the queen. I am amazing. I mean, the king's got to be wanting to honor me, and now he wants me to honor the very guy I want dead that will not honor me. And so, even do so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Verse number 11, then took Haman the apparel of the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on horseback through the street of the city and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai came again into the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. Haman was absolutely humiliated. He had to walk the horse, honoring the very man he wanted dead. Haman was just an evil man. So Esther invites him to the first banquet, and at the first banquet invites them to a second banquet. Again, not sure all the reasons why, but there was a second banquet. In Esther chapter 7 and verse number 3, this is when it was divulged that Haman was the enemy of the Jewish people. Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen or bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said to Esther the queen, who is he and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? The king is clueless. King Ahasuerus hadn't got a clue the decree that he put forth that was going to destroy the Jewish people. And so he's saying, who would do this? And Esther, while sitting there with Haman and the king, Esther said the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and queen. He's a very perceptive guy. He was able to pick up on social clues. This is not going so well. Not only have I honored Mordecai, who I would like to have destroyed, now I'm sitting with the king and the queen, and apparently this whole meeting has gone against me. And keep reading verse number 7. The king arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, the king was not happy, went into the palace garden. Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. He's smart. The king's mad. Please, he's begging for his life. He says, I know this is not good. He's begging for his life. And then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine. Haman had fallen upon the bed upon where Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in this house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So not only did Haman make a mistake being in the dinner and being an enemy to the Jewish people, and about that time, King Ahasuerus realized he's essentially been tricked to destroy the Jewish people. And he's pleading for his life, but apparently Esther has gone to the bedroom, and he follows her to the bedroom and ends up on the same bed with the queen. That's probably not a good idea if the king's already mad. It's probably not a good plan. And so the king shows up and going, now you've got my queen in the same bed with you. And about that time, they cover Haman's face. They essentially cover him up. And Harbana, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the king's wrath was pacified. So a couple of things. One is the very gallows they had made to destroy, or that Haman had ordered to be made to destroy Mordecai, now is the gallows he's hung upon, okay? And then I want you to notice this phrase, then was the king's wrath pacified. I don't know if y'all remember the phrase, but Vashti, when his wrath was appeased, very possibly the same thing happened to Vashti. So Mordecai now is going to be in charge. The king makes him in charge because Haman is now dead. In chapter 8, on that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. So ultimately, the king Ahasuerus took out that decree that he had previously made and set it aside. And now Mordecai is now in charge of all that Haman's house was once in charge of. and the Jews are ultimately victorious. We're at Esther chapter 9. Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the province. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. He just blossomed as an individual. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with a stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, did what they would unto those that hated them. So Mordecai became a huge person in King Ahasuerus' kingdom, and ended up slaying their enemies and being victorious overall. Chapter 10, verse number 1, King Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land, upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. So the Jews were ultimately victorious. So I want to get into some lessons I think we can learn from this story. It's a fun story to begin with. If you like drama and you like the good person and the bad person and all that sort of stuff, it's a great story. Great historical event for the Jewish people as well during the days of the Medo-Persian Empire. But what lessons can we learn? And I've got 4 of them that I want to talk about with you for just a couple of minutes as we close. Number 1, doing what's right's not always easy. And I specifically want to mention to our young people, but it's not just our young people. You know, a lot of times we're saying you're making decisions at a time in your life that affect you the rest of your life. And doing what's right's not always the easy thing to do. Sometimes your friends want you to do things that aren't right. And the reality is you need to do what's right, regardless. It's not always the easiest thing to do, but do what's right. It's better for you in the long run to do what's right. And most of you adults are out there this morning and you're saying, that's right, these kids need to do what's right. And I just want to tell you, that's true for the adults too. We're challenged on a daily basis in business and different things a lot of times for people to try to encourage us to not do the right thing. And I just want to encourage you to do what's right. It's not always the easy thing to do, but it is the thing that's better for you and it's better for everyone to do the right thing. And I'll give you a couple of instances in my world. In the inspection world, inevitably we're told at different times to go, well, you know, if you would do this, if you would just put this down on paper, you know, we'd go in to do an inspection and somebody would go, well, I really need this roof to be bad, you know, because I need to negotiate getting a new roof. You know, I want this roof to be bad. Well, what's going to be on the report is what it is. Doing what's right is the right thing to do, regardless. It's not always the easy thing. Somebody's standing there trying to tell you to do something else that you shouldn't do. I was telling that story one time, and other stories, there's plenty of them related to the inspection business, where people just want you to, real estate agents call and scream and holler and want you to change your report because they didn't like something that happened. And I was talking to my dad. My dad worked in a laboratory. It's the same but different. He was in a laboratory and he tested plastics. They were plastic pellets, and they made polyethylenes, what they did. And he would get in the barrels of plastics, you know, these pellets, and they would come in and they would extrude that plastic. And you had to meet certain guidelines for your customer. And their customers were like trash bag people or milk jug people or that kind of thing, dashboard people. Anything that's made out of plastic was a part of it. So the customer would say, we need polyethylene and we need it to meet these standards. And inevitably, the product didn't meet the standard and it would get kicked back. And somebody in the company would be pressing my dad to go, just make it meet the specs. All you got to do is change the paperwork and you can make it meet the specs. I think y'all know my dad. There's no way. And my dad's answer to them was, bring me a product that will pass the specifications, and you'll get a document that says it passes the specifications. Doing what's right is not always easy, but it's the thing you need to do. It's moral integrity. It's being the kind of people God wants you to be. Esther chapter 4 and verse number 16 is the example. We looked at this, but it's where she is saying, man, if I go to the king, if I perish, I perish. My life might be taken from me, but I'm willing to die. I'm going to do what's the right thing to do to help my people when it's all said and done. And I think that's one lesson we can leave here with today. Number 2, One decision affects a lot of people. Now, I don't think we recognize sometimes that even there's a series of one decisions that affect a lot of people. We've got to be careful the decisions we make. But I'm telling you that there are moments where you're making decisions that one decision can affect a lot of people, and be careful. Husbands, the decisions you make in your home affect a lot of people. We're dealing in a country today, divorce rates are rampant. There's very little honoring, it seems like, to marriage and family and those kind of things. I'm just telling you, the decision you make as a husband affect a lot of people. It affects your children, it affects your wife, be careful the decisions you make. It affects things, it affects people. Elders in the church, be careful the decisions you make, because it affects people, it affects the lives of people. Be careful the decisions you make. Now, there's a series of one decisions that happened in this story, but I want you to look at Esther 5, verse number 2. It was so when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. The king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. She made the decision, the single decision, to go in. That's a huge decision. And she was willing to do that. But you know, he made a decision to extend the golden scepter. That's a big decision. Was he just going to let anybody come into the inner chamber? He's king. But she found favor in his eyes, and he extended the golden scepter. Be careful of the decision, because that decision, had he not done that, could have destroyed her, could have destroyed all the Jewish people. But then he extends that scepter, and she's able to touch and then be able to explain what it is. Be careful of the decision you make. That one decision to be able to go in and ultimately saved her people. It affected a lot of people. Be careful of the decisions you make. And I'm just telling you, in our life today, there are decisions we're faced with every day. There are crossroads that happen. There are forks in the road, and we're determining, are we going to go right or are we going to go left? And the first thing I want to encourage you is do the right thing regardless. Even as painful as it is, do the right thing. And then secondly, that recognize the importance of that decision. That one decision affects people. Think about it, pray about it, consider it, take it seriously. That decision is an important decision. Number 3, I talked to you about Mordecai. When he perceived all that this was done in Esther 4, verse number 1, Mordecai rent his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out in the midst of the city, cried with a loud and bitter cry. And I talked to you about the fact that that really meant grief and repentance, and he rent clothes and sat in sackcloth and ashes. He was grieving for his people. He was grieving for the salvation of the Jewish people. And I want you to take as lesson number 3 today, the importance of caring about salvation of other people. How long has it been since you looked across the aisle at church and said, I'm concerned about that young man, or I'm that young lady, or I'm concerned about that gentleman or that woman that's in the church? How long has it been since it touched your heart that you cared? How long has it been since you thought about the works in Nigeria or India or Belize or other places, and you went, I'm going to pray for them? They are dealing with things that I don't even begin to imagine on a daily basis they're dealing with. And how long has it been since it grieved your heart that there are lost people in this world? How important do those souls mean to you? How important, as leadership of the church, as elders, deacons, we sit in rooms and we discuss budgets and things and all that. How long has it been since we as a leadership team grieved over the fact that there are souls that are lost and they need salvation, they need the blood of Jesus? And the decisions that are being made have purpose behind them, because we're grieving over the fact there needs to be salvation brought to this world. How long has it been since it grieved your heart that our evangelists need to be supported and that gospel can be spread to place? How long has it been since you thought about and cared about what is happening? And I'm just telling you, Mordecai is a good example to us of he was concerned in heart about her. He was concerned about her being in the king's beauty contest. He was concerned about her being queen. But even more so than that, he had been concerned about her going before the king and dying even. But it was so important even to sacrifice his own child, even if need be, to save the Jewish people. He grieved over the fact these people were going to be destroyed, the slaughter that was going to happen to them if something didn't happen, if somebody didn't intervene. And I want to encourage you, intervene. It's painful, it's challenging, it takes wisdom at times, all those kind of things to to make decisions, but intervene. If you're a mom and dad and you've got a child and their light bulb's going out, intervene, do something. And as a church, do something. Let's do something. Y'all know Jerry's line is, if you're going to make a mistake hitting somebody. Now, he doesn't really mean violently hitting somebody. It's a football analogy that he uses when he's talking to us. And it basically, his coach told him back in his football days that don't stand around on the field. When the play's going on, hit somebody, knock somebody over so the ball can move. Do something. And I think we need to take the lesson from Mordecai. Do something. Help somebody. Make a difference in the world that's around you. A little bit of Brother Scott's sermon from Wednesday night. And then number 4, our lives need purpose. There's a reason why we exist. I think ultimately that reason is to make God look good. Ephesians chapter 3, that the wisdom of God would be known by the church to the world. There's a reason why you get up every morning. There's a reason why all of us ought to get up in the morning. It ought to be the number one reason. Make God look good. There's a reason why we make the decisions we make. Make God look good when it's all said and done. And there was a reason, and it brings us back to our title, Ephesians chapter 4, verse number 14. For who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? How do we know that you weren't queen just for this very moment? And I want to tell you, you very possibly may be here in this world, at this place, at this time, specifically to make a difference in the circumstances that are around you. And recognize your purpose. Recognize why you exist. Now, I will tell you, there's decisions you're going to make. And there's going to be decisions where you live, where do you go to school, all those kind of decisions that you make in life, who you're going to marry. All those decisions are forks in the road. Do what's right, even if it's not easy to do. Recognize the importance of those decisions when they come into your life. And recognize that there is a reason why we ought to care about what we're doing. We ought to be intentional. We live with purpose. We live with intention. We're making decisions on purpose in life. And then number 4, recognizing our purpose, that we are here to make a difference around us. I'm telling you, life is fleeting. It's like a vapor. It's here for a little while. Our heart beats today. It may not beat tomorrow. You've got a short window, and I'm telling you, the older I get, the shorter that window feels. I'm telling you, all of you have a short window. You're not going to be around forever. Make this life everything that you can make it by doing the things God wants you to do in life. If the church can help you with those things, the biggest decision you can make, if you're at a fork in the road today, the biggest decision you can make in life is, I'm going to serve God. I'm going to obey the gospel. I'm going to make a decision to be baptized into Christ. Now, that's a fork in the road. You can sit there this morning and say, I'm not going to make that decision. I'm going to make this decision. Be careful the decisions you make. It affects a lot of people. It affects things. But today, you can make the decision that says, I'm standing with God. I'm going to live my life with purpose and intention. I recognize the gravity of this decision. I'm obeying the gospel. I am going to be baptized into Christ. I am going to be a part of the Lord's church. I am going to make my life have value and purpose, and I'm going to do things on purpose, with purpose. And I know it's not easy. I know there's challenges in making that decision today. There may be friends that don't care about your friendship as much anymore. Or there may be people that want you to make other decisions in life. I'm just telling you, it's not always easy to make the right decision. But this morning, as we sing this song, we're going to give you an opportunity to make that decision, the most important decision, to come to Christ, be buried with Him in baptism.